Zetetic Cosmogony, Section 3, starting with the section on geology. In, quote, Geology by Skirtley, page 101, it is confessed, quote, "So imperfect is the record of the Earth's history as told in the rocks, that we can never hope to fill up completely all the gaps in the chain of life. The testimony of the rocks has been well compared to a history of which only a few imperfect volumes remain to us, the missing portions of which we can only fill up by conjecture. What botanist but would despair of restoring the vegetation of wood and field from the dried leaves that autumn scatters? Yet from less than this the geologist has to form all the ideas of past floras. Can we wonder then at the imperfection of the geological world?" End quote. The vice president of the Royal Geographical Society of Ireland holds that this, the only Earth, was made during 6 successive periods corresponding to 6 series of rocks, and that particles of mud and sand deposited by rivers in the sea bottoms could only become rocks of a heterogeneous mixture, but never such as the primary with subdivisions, having each its own marked peculiarities. In his, quote, Errors of Geologists, page 15, he says, "Neither the brown gneiss, nor the primary red sandstone, nor the yellow quartz rock, nor the gray mica slate, nor the blue limestone, not one band of all these could be formed out of the river sediment coming down from the pre-existing continents, because not one of them has mixed particles. The quartz rocks has no lime, the limestone is purely crystalline, etc." End quote. Although the deepest mine in the world is only a few thousand feet down, the assertions of geologists that they know what underlies the so-called crust of the Earth to a depth of 4,000 miles are received as though they had actually been down making a personal inspection and favored the world with the result of their researches. Sir D. Brewster, in his More Worlds Than One, says, quote, "The proportional thickness of these different formations have been estimated by Professor Phillips as follows, but the numbers can be regarded only as a very rude estimate. Tertiary 2,000 feet, Cretaceous 1,000 feet, Oolite and Lias 2,500 feet, New Red Sandstone 2,000 feet, Carboniferous 10,000 feet, primary rocks 20,000 equals 9 miles, nearly. On these assumed data they founded different theories of volcanoes. It is taken for granted that many of the stratified rocks were deposited at the bottom of the sea by the same slow process which are now going on in the present day." End quote. Almost needless to remark that whatever speculations have nothing better than taken for granted to support them must be rejected as purely fanciful and utterly incapable of proof. Geologists are very fond of parading their knowledge of what they are pleased to term the glacial period of the Earth's history. Sir R. Ball writes a book on the cause of an ice age, but he vitiates the entire volume by stating, quote, "I have found it necessary to assume the existence of several ice ages." End quote. He then goes on to endeavor to prove his assumption to be correct by stating, quote, "In fact, it might almost be said that the astronomical theory of accounting for the ice ages must be necessarily true, as it is a strictly mathematical consequence from the laws of gravitation." End quote. We've already seen that this magical, indefinable, what-do-you-call-it influence has no existence in terms of gravitation. We may therefore reject the learned writer's so-called mathematical consequence as a mere myth. In his, quote, "Second appeal to common sense from the extravagance of some recent geology," end quote, Sir H. H. Howarth, KCIEMPFRS says, quote, "One of the chief objects of this book is to show that the glacial theory, as usually taught, is not sound, but that it ignores and is at issue with the laws which govern the movements of ice, while the geological phenomenon to be explained refuse to be equated with it. This is partially acknowledged by the principal apostles of the ice theory. They admit that ice as we know it in the laboratory, or ice as we know it in the glaciers, acts quite differently to the ice they postulate and produces different effects. But we are bidden to put aside our puny experiments, which can be tested, and turn from the glaciers which can be explored and examined, to the vast potentiality of ice in the shape of portentous ice sheets beyond the reach of empirical tests, and which we are told acted quite differently to ordinary ice. That is to say, they appeal from sublunary experiments to a priori argument drawn from a transcendental world. Assuredly, this is a curious position for the champions of uniformity to occupy. I hold that the glacial theory, as ordinarily taught, is based not upon induction, but upon hypothesis, some of which are incapable of verification, while others can be shown to be false, and it has all the infirmity of the science of the Middle Ages. This is why I have called it a glacial nightmare. Holding it to be false, I hold further that no theory of modern times has had a more disastrously mischievous effect upon the progress of natural science. I not only disbelieve it, but I utterly deny the possibility of ice having moved over 100 of miles of level country, such as we see in Poland and Russia, and the prairies of North America, and distributed the drift as we find it there. I further deny its capacity to mount long slopes, or to traverse uneven ground. I similarly deny to it the excavating and denuding power which has been attributed to it by those who claim it as the excavator of lakes and valleys, and I altogether question the legitimacy of arguments based upon a supposed physical capacity which cannot be tested by experiment, and which is entirely based upon hypothesis. This means that I utterly question the prime postulate of the glacial theory itself." End quote. In the Scientific American supplement of 10th September 1898, in an article on, quote, "Glacial Geology in America" by H. L. Fairchild, the following is stated: "The cause of the glacial period remains quite as much a mystery as it was in 1840. A large body of fact has been collected, but it points in different directions. Every person has entire liberty of opinion. Most glacialists have no opinion at all upon this subject." End quote. The reader need not trouble to have any opinion on the subject, for there never was a glacial period in the history of the world. We challenge the whole scientific world to prove the romance. A. McInnes, in his paper, quote, "The Flood in Geology," says, "Next, how was the flood caused? Moses says, by the opening of the netting, not windows of heaven, to pour down rain, and by the opening of the fountains of the great abyss of waters. What deplorable ignorance prevails regarding the true constitution of the universe! The old pagan delusion of Pythagoras is now generally believed in opposition to common sense, reason, and God's own revelation, that men are now living on an impossible large ball of land and water, flashed above and round the sun more quickly than a thunderbolt. Thus the apostle's prediction is fulfilled, that men in the last days would not endure sound doctrine, but would give heed to fables. As of old, so now, they glorify not God, but have become vain in their reasonings, and their heart is darkened. Professing themselves wise, they have become fools." Romans 1, verse 21. We have God's own revelation, Job 38, manifestly opposed to the fables now falsely called science. God asks of Job, "Where wast thou when I laid the foundation of the earth? Where has the earth or land been fixed? He has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the floods. The earth standing out of the water and in the water. Thus the land does not, and is assumed without proof by modern astronomers, contain the sea, but the sea contains the land, and is the great abyss out of which the dry land appeared at God's creative word. Genesis 1:9. Likewise, the Antarctic icebergs surround the sea on every side, utterly baffling all attempts of navigators to proceed further south. Who shut up the sea with doors, and prescribed it for my decree, and set bars and doors, and said, Hitherto thou shalt come, but no further, and here shall thy proud waves be stayed. Job 38. Next, as to the structure of earth, it was asked, Who has set its layers, or laid its measures, or who stretched out a measuring line upon it? On what are its bases or sockets sunk? Or who laid down its keystone rock? This rendering is precisely according to the Hebrew. Now, does not the 5th verse plainly declare that the earth's strata or layers were arranged by God himself, and not according to suppositions of modern geologists? The layers are found to be set with the regularity and exactness of the stones of a house, and as if the builder's measuring line had been used. The unstratified or keystone rock, whether basalt or granite, lowest on the sea but above, are the various beds according to density, such as sandstone, slate, limestone, coal, chalk, clay, with sand and gravel or soil on the surface. How the all-wise God did 6,000 years ago produce by his almighty word the vast construction of the earth's interior in such wonderful order, and all within a few hours, not during millions of years, as the geologists foolishly suppose, as the awful mystery. God's ways are not as man's, nor his thoughts as ours. He also in the beginning made all the various kinds of animals, not according to a slow process of growth or development, but the birds and the fishes on the 5th day, beasts, creeping things, and man on the 6th day, each kind separate from the other, contrary to our own atheistic supposition of evolution, and the day limited by the evening and morning, 12 hours. Are there not 12 hours in the day? Asked the Lord. Thus the whole mighty mass of rock, stratified and unstratified, has been made to float upon the unfathomable waters, yet as securely fixed as a ship in a Liverpool dock. The bases of the earth are so sunk as to make it immovable forever. Man is challenged to tell, upon what are its bases sunk? Job 38. He founded the earth on its basis. It is not moved for ever and ever. Psalms 104:5. Now, why can an iron ship float, though that metal is 7 times heavier than the water? Because, chiefly, of the shape. But the heaviest rock is only 3 times the weight of water. Then consider the tremendous buoyancy of the ocean, causing some substances to float on the surface, and others to sink only to a certain depth. The earth, its density decreasing from the foundation rock upwards to the soil of the surface, is sunk to a depth several miles in the sea, yet so as to have a dry surface, and shores on a level with the surrounding waters. It consists of 4 continents of an irregular and somewhat triangular shape, stretching out from the central north, thousands of miles towards the icy barriers of the far south, against which winds and waves rage in vain. The continents are connected by submarine rocky beds varying in depth, whilst the Arctic and Antarctic oceans are found to be unfathomable. The flood, as we have seen, was caused by the opening of the netting of heaven and the fountains of the abyss. The heaven or sky is an expanse for the clouds, strong as molten mirror, Job 37:18, and was made on the 2nd day of creation to separate the waters above from the waters below. Hast thou come to the springs of the sea? Asks God, 38:16. It was formerly the opinion of Christian writers that these springs or fountains are in the central north, confined by the impenetrable walls of ice, which were broken down at the flood. However, when Noah had entered the ark from heaven, and the abyss rushed the waters to fulfill God's purpose to destroy the earth with its inhabitants. Hence, the rending of rocks, the shattering of hills, the breaking up of earth's strata, the piling of mass upon mass, wherein were buried animals and plants to be dug up many centuries afterwards. All lands were filled with the wreck of the old world, a terrible warning to all future ages against the commission of unrighteousness. And let it be noted that the petrification of fossils is not surprising, seeing that the earth was wholly sunk under the waters for a whole year. Even geologists confess that the degree of petrification is no proof of the antiquity of a fossil. The mere amount of change, then, which the fossil has undergone, is not by any means a proof of the length of time that has elapsed since it was buried in the earth, as that amount depends so largely on the nature of the materials in which it was entombed, and on the circumstances that have since surrounded it. Then, what was the origin of the rocks, indeed of the entire earth? Aqueous, according to Genesis. In the beginning of God's framing the heavens and the earth was in loose atoms and empty. The Hebrew. Where were the loose atoms? In the abyss of waters. And God, on the third day of creation, consolidated all into rocks, stratified and unstratified, causing the lands to appear. But why is man not found as a fossil embedded among the rocks, as are the animals? The answer is not difficult. Before the flood, man was not so prolific as now. During the 1656 years of the Old World, there were, according to Moses, only 10 generations counting from Adam to Noah, and Noah during 600 years had only 3 sons. However, let us reckon approximately the antediluvian population, allowing 8 children to each couple. First generation, 2. Second generation, 8. Third generation, 32. Fourth generation, 128. Fifth generation, 512. Sixth, 2048. Seventh, 8,192. Eighth, 32,768. Ninth, 131,072. Tenth, 524,288. The sum is 699,050 people. And the whole human population before the flood might not amount to 1/6 of the population of London. Be it remembered that mankind in the Old World dwelt in Asiatic Turkey, speaking the same language, and it was not till after Noah's death that the dispersion from Babel over the earth took place. Asiatic Turkey contains at present 15 million human beings, and there only could fossilized man be found. To what extent, if at all, has that country been geologically examined? Is it possible to deliver men from the spell and sorcery of great names? If only a fable or a lie is called scientific, and fathered by a writer reputed a great man, how many thousands believe at once without proof? Is it not as hard to turn men from the worship of their fellow worms as to turn a Hindu from the worship of sticks and stones? The scientific favorites of newspaper scribblers are larded over with flattery until the reputation of greatness is attained, and to argue against pet scientific fictions is only to provoke silly jesting or astonishment at presumption of daring to differ from the scientific slave-drivers. Will any of their slaves of science dare be free or use their common sense? Is geology not a tissue of suppositions from beginning to end? And let us see. How do the geologists manage to get dupes? Some disguised infidel who has had sufficient influence to obtain a professorship in a college writes a book about the creation, in which he attempts to prove the entire satisfaction of atheistic journalists that the world made itself without the help of a creator at all. Of course, the blasphemous character of the book is carefully veiled, lest soft-headed religionists take alarm, and the book does not sell. Perhaps even a pious whine is dropped so that the work of Judas may be done more effectually. And the author is reputed so very great a man, for all the newspapers say it. By the way of preface, astronomy is appealed to as a science so well established that none but fools object to it. Therefore, the reader must imagine all the vast continents and oceans making up a ball no larger than the schoolroom globe. Next, he is assured that recent researchers in science have proved that those lights, the sun, the moon, the stars, consist of the very same constituents as the earth and the sea, as well as the nebula, which science supposes to be clouds of glowing gas. So all these must have had a common origin, and therefore the simpleton must next imagine the schoolroom globe along with the sun, the moon, and the stars changed into a quantity of fiery gas. In the beginning, how many million years ago science cannot yet decide, was a gas, is the dogma of geology. But he dare not ask about the origin of the gas itself. Then the mesmerist requires him to suppose that all the fiery mass very conveniently began to cool, particularly in a quantity in the center, which also whirled about until it became the sun. The victim of duplicity is next to suppose that other quantities also cooled until they changed into planets. Especially one quantity went on cooling until it very conveniently became the earth ball with a rocky crust, and though on fire originally, yet a portion of it changed into all the oceans and the seas. In the study of science, says Dr. Dick in his book on geology, one is permitted to suppose anything, if he will but remember and acknowledge to others that he only makes suppositions, will give reasons to show that his suppositions may be true, and be ready at any time to give up his suppositions when facts go against them. The last of these two suppositions, namely the gradual cooling of the world from a state of intense heat, is often made by those who wish to form to themselves a notion of how the rocks and rivers, mountains and plains of the world have been brought to exist as they are. Can the foolish geologists, instead of making these absurd suppositions, not believe the fact that God made the world as stated on God's own authority? Instead, however, of opening their eyes, they further suppose that, despite the cooling, as much fire remained inside the ball as heaved up the rocky crust into mountain chains, whilst the waters went on channeling and leveling so as to make all the river and ocean beds. Then the rivers would carry down to the lakes and seas matter containing animal and vegetable remains to form sediment, which we must suppose hardened after millions of years into rocks, especially the stratified ones, the unstratified rock being supposed due to the original fire. All these atheistic suppositions are expressed in the works of Greek origin so as to amaze the gaping simpleton. The rocks immediately above the unstratified are called metamorphic. Next, in ascending order, are the Paleozoic, or primary, the Mesozoic, or secondary, the Cainozoic, or including the tertiary, and quaternary. The guesses about fossils make up paleontology. Now let it be observed that not one of these suppositions is even probable. Whoever saw gas changed into granite, or a fiery vapor into water, or a river channel its own bed? Is there within the memory of mankind one considerable mountain more or less on the earth, notwithstanding volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, one considerable county more or less, or what continent has materially changed its shape? What do fossils prove? The following is a confession from Skirchley's Geology, page 101. Quote, "So imperfect is the record of the earth's history, as told in these rocks, that we never can hope to fill up completely all the gaps in the chain of life. The testimony of the rocks has been well compared to a history of which only a few imperfect volumes remain to us, the missing portions of which we can only fill up by conjecture. What botanist would but despair of restoring the vegetation of wood and field from the dry leaves that autumn scatters? Yet from less than this the geologist has to form all his ideas of past floras. Can we wonder then at the imperfection of the geological world?" End quote. Indeed, it is confessed that the age of a fossil is not determined by the degree of its petrification, but by the age of the rock in which it is embedded, and the age of the rock by its position among the strata. Have men in these last days become so silly that with old bones and stones and footmarks they may be led to deny the very Creator that made them? But was not this folly foretold ages ago by the inspired Hebrew prophets? Quote, each layer of rock is supposed by geologists to have occupied an indefinite number of millions of years, and the age of the earth is still more a mystery to them. Professor Thompson, who is a scientific dictator, has, however, announced that the solidification of the earth could not have taken less than 20 million years, and not more than 400 million years, and so that the date of the world's beginning is somewhere between these two numbers. Some time ago, geologists proved from scientific data, to their own entire satisfaction and that of their dupes, that the earth is a ball of liquid fire with a thin crust of rock, so that at a depth of 25 miles the rocks must melt, and at 150 miles they would go off into vapor. Dr. Dick's Natural History, page 121. But Professor Thompson has found out that those suppositions do not square with the supposition of gravitation, and accordingly he supposes rather that the mass of the earth cannot be much less rigid than a globe of steel of the same size would be, yet that there must be some quantity of the fiery liquid left in the interior, enough at least to cause earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. What tinkering the imaginary globe of the astronomer needs! Some geologists, such as Jukes, are not certain whether the earth is a molten mass at first, and whether granite is of igneous or aqueous origin. Formerly, rocks were classified as primary, transition, secondary, tertiary, recent, but now a new arrangement, the transitionary rocks, are denied any place in the series. Jukes says that he holds, quote, views with regard to the Devonian period which differ from those taken by most geologists, and that the question is hardly yet settled. Page 203. Also, regarding the stratified rocks, he observes, quote, that at one time it was thought that there was some essential distinction in the nature of these rocks and their mode of formation. It is now known that the primary rocks, when first formed, were exactly like the corresponding secondary and tertiary. Page 202. Indeed, is there anything certain about geology, except that it is disguised atheism, denying the Creator, the Most High? Geologists profess to prove extinct species. Of course, they can produce large bones to show that at one time there were large elephants and lizards, but are big dogs not dogs as really little ones are dogs? Is it a fact, according to Moses, that there were human giants before the flood, and that, since the lower animals have degenerated in size and age as well as men, need not surprise this 19th century of crime and infidelity? But the trick of comparative anatomy is to claim with an old bone the power of reproducing the sketch of the entire animal, though formerly unknown. If the monkey had been unknown to Darwin and scientists, would they have been able, by seeing one hand only, to tell that the beast has 4 hands? If zoologists think the serpents once had wings or feet, let them read Genesis. Quote, on thy belly thou shalt go. Let scientists, ere concluding that any kind of animal has become extinct, consider the words of Jukes himself. Quote, as all the truth about anything whatever is absolutely unattainable by us, it would only lead us astray if we required it from geology, or reasoned as if we had attained it. Page 202. But recently the existence of the gorilla became known. What of the Leviathan, the swift serpent, the crooked serpent, the dragon that is in the sea? Isaiah 20:27. Is it not chiefly the fossilized bones of the sea serpent that geologists are exhibiting as the remains of extinct species of a vast size? No wonder the present existence of the Leviathan is so eagerly denied. End quote. S. Lang, in his Modern Science and Modern Thought, page 27, informs us that, quote, the total thickness of known strata is about 130,000 feet or 25 miles. Of this, about 30,000 feet belonging to the Laurentian, which is the oldest known stratified deposit, 18,000 feet to the Cambrian, and 22,000 to the Silurian. These form together what is known as the primary or Paleozoic epoch. Mr. Lang is very careful to omit the names of those who know strata for a depth of 25 miles. Can it be that he has been down there himself? If so, we may expect to have further revelations as to the contents of the bowels of the earth. But no, he cannot have been there, for he tells us a little further on, page 37, at this rate of increase water would boil at a depth of 10,000 feet, and iron and all other metals be melted before we reached 100,000 feet. We are thus satisfied that the gifted author was not actually there, or he would have been melted in company with iron and all other metals, of course. This is a relief, and enables us to at once and forever dispose of this wild theory as baseless assumption. In a certain case before the magistrate, the culprit hardly liked to say that the witness against him was telling a lie, so he mildly said that the witness was handling the truth very carelessly. When Mr. Lang has the impertinence to tell us what lies below the surface of the earth for a depth of 25 miles, we are bound to say that he handles the truth in a careless and most reprehensible manner. With the usual unqualified manner for which scientists have become famous, Mr. Lang goes on to say, quote, reasoning from these facts, assuming this rate of change in the form of life to have been the same formerly, Lyell has arrived at the conclusion that geology requires a period of not less than 200 millions of years to account for the phenomenon which it discloses. End quote. To reason from facts and then assume something which is in its very essence utterly incapable of proof is bad enough, but to miscall fictions facts and then to add on to them whatever assumption is necessary to maintain the result in keeping with the theory with which the start has made is so atrocious that we are again forced to the conclusion that geologists are lost in the fogs of their own creation and cannot find their way through the millions of ages of their own imagination to anything having the remotest bit of truth in it. Once more, and I have done with Mr. Lang and his geology, he informs us in the work already referred to that, quote, the law of gravity, which is the foundation of most of what we call the natural laws of geological action, has certainly prevailed, as will be shown later, through the enormous periods of geological time, and far beyond this we can discern it operating in those astronomical changes by which cosmic matter has been condensed into nebulae, nebulae into suns, throwing off planets, and planets throwing off satellite moons as they cooled and contracted. End quote. The laws of geological action being based on a myth, the law of gravitation, geology itself may be thrown off into space without any ill effects being felt anywhere. Geology and astronomy at present, as taught by the schoolmen, are nothing more than fables. Hear what the Future of February 1892 says, quote, astronomers are very fond of boasting of the wonderful exactness of their science, and that it is based upon the principles of incontrovertible mathematics, and of ridiculing astrology as pseudoscience. The exactness belongs to practical and not to theoretical astronomy. For example, when the writer learnt the principles of astronomy at school, he was taught that the sun was exactly 95 millions of miles from the earth. Nowadays, astronomers say that this was an error, that the sun is only 92 millions of miles distant. Newton made the sun's distance to be 28 millions of miles, Kepler made it 12 million, Martin 81 million, and Mayer 104 million. Dr. Woodhouse, who was professor of astronomy at Cambridge about 50 years ago, was so candid as to admit the weakness of the Newtonian speculations. Woodhouse wrote, quote, however perfect our theory, and however simply and satisfactorily the Newtonian hypothesis may seem to us to account for all of the celestial phenomenon, yet we are here compelled to admit the astounding truth that if our premises be disputed and our facts challenged, The whole range of astronomy does not contain the proofs of its own accuracy. End quote. The horizon. According to tables of curvature compiled to suit the mathematical factors and tentative formulas employed in the imaginary geodetic operations, which have from time to time been conducted in observatories, the horizon of an observer is distant or near according to the greatness or otherwise of his elevation above the surface of the supposed globe. If he stands 24 feet above sea level, for example, he is said to be in the center of a circle which bounds his vision, the radius of which, in any direction on a clear day, is 6 miles. A local gentleman tells me that he has watched a boat race in New Zealand, seeing the boats all the way out and home, the distance being 9 miles from where he was standing on the beach. I have seen the hull of a steamer with the naked eye at an elevation of not more than 24 feet, at a distance of 12 miles, and in taking observations along the South African coast, have sometimes had an horizon of at least 20 miles at an elevation of only 20 feet. The distance of the horizon or vanishing point, where the sky appears to touch the earth and sea, is determined largely by the weather, and when that is clear, by the power of our vision. This is proved by the fact that the telescope will increase the distance of the horizon very greatly and bring objects into view which are entirely beyond the range of vision of the unaided eye. But, as no telescope can pierce a segment of water, the legitimate conclusion we are forced to arrive at is that the surface of the water is level, and that, therefore, the shape of the world cannot be globular, and on such a flat or level surface, the greater the elevation of the observer, the longer will his range of vision be, and thus the further he can see. On the term level, advocates of the globular form of the world often fall back on the meaning of the term level, affirming that a level surface means an even surface and not a horizontal or a flat one. That is to say that a convex surface, if free from any irregularities, is even or level. In Nuttall's Standard Dictionary, 1892 edition, page 409, the following is the definition of level. Quote, horizontal, even, flat, on the same line of plane. End quote. This shows that level is the same as horizontal or flat, and could not possibly apply to a convex surface. In the Cruise of the Falcon by E.F. Knight, the following occurs on page 2 of volume 2. Quote, there are no curves on the way, the rails being carried in one perfectly straight line across the level plains. End quote. Level here means flat or horizontal, as the plains in South America are known to be for thousands of square miles. In Robinson's New Navigation and Surveying, page 25, says, quote, the spirit level, which is usually on the underside of the surveyor's transit instrument, is used to determine a horizontal line. A horizontal line is at right angles to a vertical. It is a level line. End quote. The following is from the same work again, page 33, quote, to adjust a theodolite, measure very carefully the distance between two stations, and set the instrument halfway between them. Now bring the level near to one of the stations, level it carefully, and sight the rod. Note the number on the rod, say 6 feet, and have the rod man go to the other station, and place his target on the rod just 6 feet. When the telescope is turned upon it, the horizontal spider line ought to just coincide with the target, and will, if the instrument is level or in perfect adjustment. End quote. From the foregoing, it is very clear that level means horizontal and cannot mean convex. G.F. Chambers, in his Story of the Solar System, pages 84 and 85, quotes Sir H. Holland as seeing the eclipsed moon with the sun above the horizon. I quote the following from Mr. Chambers. Quote, This spectacle requires, however, a combination of circumstances rarely occurring: a perfectly clear eastern and western horizon, and an entirely level intervening surface such as that of the sea or the African desert." End quote. In a lunar eclipse such as described, the sun is distant from the moon a half circle, or 180 degrees, both luminaries being 90 degrees from the observer, so that on a convex surface it would be quite impossible to see both bodies at the same time, but quite possible from a level or horizontal surface, which actually was the case. To see about 6,000 miles to the sun on the one side and about 6,000 miles to the moon on the other side, one would require to be projected 4,000 miles into space above the horizon of the globe in order to overcome the convexity in the distance. Thus, level, we are again assured, means horizontal or flat, or on the same line of plane as the dictionary informs us. In The Voyage of Naturalists, by Charles Darwin, page 328, the following is stated: "I was reminded of the pampas of Buenos Aires by seeing the disk of the rising sun intersected by an horizon level as that of the ocean." End quote. The surface here referred to was a flat one, and such are called llanos, or level fields, in South America. Level, therefore, signifies flat or horizontal. Lighthouses. The distance at which lights can be seen at sea entirely disposes of the idea that we are living on a huge ball. From a tract, The Bible versus Science, by J.C. Acaster, Hull, I extract the following. Quote, "A lighthouse on the Isle of Wight, 180 feet high, St. Catherine's, has recently been fitted with an electric light of such penetrating power, 7,000,000 candles, that it can be seen 42 miles. At this distance, according to modern science, the vessel would be 996 feet below the horizon." Extract from a letter written by a passenger on board the Iberia Orient Line RMS. "At noon on Thursday, 27th of September, we were 169 miles from port. Said, by the ship's log, our rate of steaming was 324 miles in 24 hours. At 12 p.m. we were alongside the lighthouse at Port Said, it having become visible at 7:30, when it was about 58 miles away. It is an ordinary tower, about as high as the tower at Springhead, 60 feet, lit by electricity. According to modern science, the vessel would be 2,182 feet below the horizon." Extract from Manx Sun, July 24th, 1894, quote, "The weather of late has been very fine. It was a splendid sight on Sunday evening to see the land in Ayr and Cumberland so clear that houses could be seen with the naked eye, and the smoke from the Whitehaven and other towns could be seen very distinctly. Ramsey Bay appeared as if it was enclosed by the surrounding land, from Black Combe to the point of Ayr, Welney Light being distinctly distance of 45 miles. In February 1894, a discussion on the subject of the shape of the world was carried on in the columns of Cape Argus, Cape Town, by the writer on one side, and three antagonists on the other. From the evidence of the edition, the paper, in a footnote to the first letter of Ancient Mariner, that Dasson Island Light had been seen from the Peach Road at Sea Point, it was shown that water is level. The light is 155 feet above sea level at its focal plane, and, according to the published report of the Inspector of Public Works for 1893, had been seen from the bridge of a mail steamer more than 40 miles away. This Ancient Mariner did not believe, and asked if anything had gone wrong with the shape of the earth hereabouts. One of his supporters, in a letter to the paper, after the editor had stated that the light had been seen from the beach road at Sea Point, 33 miles, stated that by climbing a hill so many feet, the light might be seen. Thus will ignorant prejudice flaunt itself in the face of truth. If the Earth were a globe, it is evident that Dawson Island Light could not be seen from a steamer's bridge 40 miles away, nor from an elevation of 20 feet at a distance of 33 miles. In the former case, allowing 40 feet for the altitude of observer, the light would be 871 feet below the horizon, and in the latter, 551 feet below. At the close of the controversy, I challenged this ancient mariner to test the case by an appeal to an experiment on the waters of Table Bay, and I am still waiting an acceptance of that challenge. I am now credibly informed that the bluff light, Natal, has been seen at sea from a distance of 30 miles. This light is 282 feet above sea level, and should, according to the globe theory, have been 298 feet below the horizon, allowing 20 feet for the height of observer. Another and unconscious witness to the fact of the horizontality of water is Mr. Smith of Cape Point, as the following shows. A light from afar. To the editor of Cape Times. Sir, at 9 o'clock this evening the Danger Point light was distinctly visible to the naked eye from the homestead at Cape Point, about 150 feet above sea level. This being the first occasion since the erection of the Danger Point lighthouse on which the flashes of light have been noticed by myself. The light must be most powerful to be seen from a distance of over 50 miles on a clear night. I timed a half-minute interval between each 3 quick flashes. In a letter from the engineer of public works dated Cape Town, 2nd February 1898, I'm informed that, quote, the focal plane of Point Danger Lighthouse is elevated 150 feet above high water level. According to this, therefore, if the world be a globe, the light should have been 1,666 feet below Mr. Smith's line of sight. In Answers of 2nd May, 1896, the following appears, quote, the steeple or stump, as it is locally called, of the parish church of St. Botolph at Boston, on the southeast coast of Lincolnshire near the Wash, has been utilized as a lighthouse. The tower is 290 feet in height and resembles that of Antwerp Cathedral, being crowned by a beautiful octagonal lantern. This tower, being visible 40 miles distant, serves as a lighthouse to guide mariners when entering what are called the Boston and Lynn Deeps. According to globular principles, this light should be hidden below the horizon for nearly 800 feet. From Music and Morals by H.R. Haweis, I extract the following. Quote, the Antwerp spire is 403 feet high from the foot of the tower. Strasbourg measures 468 feet from the level of the sea, but less than 403 feet from the level of the plain. By the clear morning light from the steeple at Notre Dame at Antwerp, the panorama can hardly be surpassed. 126 steeples may be counted, far and near. Facing northward, the Scheldt winds winds away until it loses itself in a white line, which is none other than the North Sea. By the aid of a telescope, ships can be distinguished out of the horizon, and the captains declare they can see the lofty spire at 150 miles distant. Middleburg at 75 miles, Fleecing 65 miles, are also visible from the steeple. Looking towards Holland, we can distinguish Breda and Walladu, each about 54 miles off. End quote. The above spire would be out of sight a full mile below the horizon at a distance of 150 miles, assuming the globe Earth, and as no telescope can piece a segment of water, the conclusion is that water is in fact level. The Earth Review of July 1894 says, quote, the captain of the SS Milo, referring to the question as to how far a powerful light can be seen, says, the other day, when off Skagen, the rays from Hanscholmen Lighthouse were distinctly visible, though the light was fully 72 miles away. Mr. B. wrote and asked how the light could be seen unless the lighthouse was 3,500 feet above sea level. This is the official reply he received. Editorial Department, Titbits, December 21st, 1892. Quote, "The paragraph you refer to was sent me by the captain of the SS Milo, and he vouched for its accuracy. Under these circumstances, I cannot enter into a discussion as to the possibility of his being able to see it or not. P.S. Mr. B. allowed that he reported observation was made from a masthead 100 feet above sea level." End quote. In the Argus Annual for 1894, it is stated on pages 207 and 271, quote, "Natal Bluff Light, 292 feet above water level, has been seen at a distance of 30 miles." End quote. According to globe measurement, it should have been about 300 feet below the line of sight. The Natal Mercury of 18th July 1898 states, quote, "The Cape La Agulhas lighthouse is to be reconstructed to allow of the introduction of a flashlight. The lighthouse erected 2 miles from Fish River has been completed. The tower is 33 feet high and 238 feet above sea level, and the flashlight is visible for over 50 miles. This light would be 1,400 feet below an observer's line of sight at an elevation of 28 feet, if the world was a globe. The following is extracted from scraps of 27th August 1898. Quote, "I have recently received the following letter, which I confess fogs me about as much as the writer of it complains of being fogged. Sir, in your issue number 772, you give an account of the lighthouse at New York, Liberty enlightening the world. You say the light can be seen a full 60 miles away at sea, and I think you must be mistaken. A textbook I have by me, Surveying and Leveling, gives 8 inches per mile, actually 7.962 inches, as the correction to be made for curvature of the Earth's surface in setting out canals, railways, and etc., varying inversely with the square of the distance. Thus, 60 times 8 divided by 12 equals 2,400 feet, and making allowance for the light being 326 feet above sea level, it should be 2,074 feet below the horizon at 60 miles. Now, 1, either your figures are wrong, or 2, the weight of the statue has flattened the earth for 60 miles or roundabout, or 3, surveyors do not allow 8 inches for curvature, and let their canals and railways stick out over the side of the earth like gigantic fishing rods. I confess I am in a fog. Can you enlighten me in your Facts and Fancies column? Yours truly, Foggy." I won't attempt to analyze Foggy's fogging calculations, but he is certainly very wrong. Any navigator will tell you that the horizon is visible at about 15 miles from the hurricane deck of a steamer, at 20 from the bridge deck, and at a proportionately greater distance from the masthead. But beyond this, you have to remember the added penetration given to lighthouse lights by means of refraction and reflection." End quote. A light can only be seen on the surface of a globe at a distance of the square of which multiplied by 8 inches, nearly, is equal to its height. This applies no matter how powerful the light may be, because no light can pierce through water, nor can the natural eye, with or without the aid of a glass, do so. But, says someone, there is no allowance made for refraction in any of the foregoing calculations. That is quite true, but constitutes no valid objection in the light of the following extract from the Encyclopedia Britannica article on leveling. Quote, "We suppose the visual rays to be a straight line, whereas on account of the unequal densities of the air at different distances from the earth, the rays of light are incurvated by refraction. The effect of this is to lessen the difference between the true and apparent levels, but in such an extremely variable and uncertain manner that if any constant or fixed allowance is made for it in formula or tables, it will often lead to a greater error than what it was intended to obviate. For though the refraction may at a mean compensate for about 1/7 of the curvature of the earth, it sometimes exceeds 1/5, and at other times does not amount to 1/15, We have therefore made no allowance for refraction in the foregoing formula." End quote. We are fairly entitled to conclude, therefore, from the reliable data furnished as to how far lights at sea can be seen, that the world is an extended plane and not the globe of astronomical speculation. The Midnight Sun. M. Paul B. du Chaillu published a few years ago a work entitled "The Land of the Midnight Sun," which the following extracts are taken. Quote, "The sun at midnight is always north of the observer, on account of the position of the earth. It seems to travel around in a circle, requiring 24 hours for its completion, it being noon when it reaches the greatest elevation, and midnight at the lowest. Its ascent and descent are so imperceptible at the pole, and the variation so slight, that it sinks south very slowly, and its disappearance below the horizon is almost immediately followed by its reappearance. We have here spoken as if the observer were on a level with the horizon, but should he climb to a mountain, the sun of course will appear higher, and should he, instead of traveling 15 miles north, climb about 220 feet above the sea level each day, he would see it the same as if he had gone north. Consequently, if he stood at the Arctic Circle at that elevation and had an unobstructed view of the horizon, he would see the sun one day sooner. Hence, tourists from Haparanda prefer going to Avasaksa, a hill 680 feet above the sea, from which, though 8 or 10 miles south of the Arctic Circle, they can see the midnight sun for 3 days. As the voyage drew to a close and we approached the upper end of the Gaff of Bothnia, the twilight had disappeared, and between the setting and rising of the sun hardly 1 hour elapsed. Haparanda is in 65 degrees 51 minutes north latitude and 41 miles south of the Arctic Circle. It is 1 degree 18 minutes further north than the Archangel, and in the same latitude as the most northern part of Iceland. The sun rises on the 21st of June at 12:01 a.m. and sets at 11:37 p.m. From the 22nd to the 25th of June, the traveler may enjoy the sight of the midnight sun from Avasaksa, a hill 680 feet high and about 45 miles distant on the other side of the stream, and should he be a few days later, by driving north on the high road, he still may have the opportunity of seeing it." End quote. If the earth be a globe, at midnight the eye would have to penetrate thousands of miles of land and water, even at 65 degrees north latitude, in order to see the sun at midnight. That the sun can be seen for days together in the far north during the northern summer proves that there is something very seriously wrong with the globular hypothesis. Besides this, how is it that the midnight sun is never seen in the south during the southern summer? Cook penetrated as far south as 71 degrees, Weddell in 1893 reached as far as 74 degrees, and Sir James C. Ross in 1841 and 1842 reached the 78th parallel, but I am not aware that any of these navigators have left it on record that the sun was seen at midnight in the south. Captain Woodside of the American barkentine Echo at Cape Town on the 26th of June, 1898, reports that he had been a good deal in the Great Southern Ocean, and often, when in latitude 62 degrees south, he has had a kind of daylight all night, but not sufficient to read by, but the midnight sun was never actually seen. Since writing the foregoing, I have received from the Secretary of the Royal Belgian Geographical Society a paper entitled Expedition Antarcticae, België. In this paper it is stated by Lieutenant de Gerlach, the commander of the expedition, that, quote, "On the 17th of May the sun set, and was not seen above our horizon again until the 21st of July." End quote. This was during the severest part of the winter at latitude 71 degrees 36 minutes south. On pages 9 and 10 of the same pamphlet, it is stated that the ship quitted her winter quarters on the 14th of February. She had thus been a winter and summer in the ice at that latitude. During the winter, the extraordinary phenomenon of total darkness caused by the total disappearance of the sun for 2 months is duly recorded, and had the sun been seen at midnight in the summer, it is only natural and reasonable that such another extraordinary phenomenon should have been chronicled. But there is not one single word in the pamphlet about that matter. We conclude, therefore, that there is no midnight sun in the south. The midnight sun can be seen in the north during the summer at 66 degrees of latitude north, and if there be the same extraordinary phenomenon in the south, it must have been seen in the latitude the Belgica reached much sooner and longer than it is in the north at latitude 66. Motions of the Earth. In the Story of the Heavens by Sir R. Ball, the following accounts of the motions of the earth globe are given. Quote, "It became certain that whatever were the shape of the earth, it was at all events something detached from all other bodies and poised without visible support in space." Page 6. Ptolemy saw how this mighty globe was poised in what he believed to be the center of the universe. Page 7. Copernicus proved that the appearances presented in the daily rising and setting of the sun and stars could all be accounted for by the supposition that the earth rotated. The second great principle which has conferred immortal glory on Copernicus assigned to the earth its true position in the universe. Copernicus transferred the center to the sun, and he established the somewhat humiliating truth that our earth is merely a planet. Page 87. The discovery that our earth must be a globe isolated in space was in itself a mighty exertion of human intellect. Page 517. We know that the earth rotates on its axis once every day. End quote. After all this unsound speculation, of which we know every line to be false, it is somewhat amusing to listen to another professor of equal authority with the Astronomer Royal with Cheese of Ireland. Professor J. Norman Lockyer, in his Astronomy Section 4, says, quote, "You have to take it as a proved that the earth moves. Day and night are the best proofs that the earth does really spin. Without this spinning, there could be no day and night, so that the regular succession of day and night is caused by this spinning. Hence, the appearances connected with the rising and setting of the sun may be due either to our earth being at rest and the sun and stars traveling round it, or the earth itself turning round while the sun and stars are at rest." End quote. When he says our earth, it seems to give more trouble to our astronomers than all the heavenly bodies put together. If, as Professor Lockyer says, either the earth is at rest and the stars are moving, or the stars at rest and the earth is moving, how is it that the wise men of the observatories have never once attempted to ascertain data to prove whether it is the earth or the stars that move? How is it that they are content to go on year after year, laboring under what is at best a supposition that the earth moves, when the phenomenon, according to their own showing, may be as well accounted for either by the earth being at rest and the sun and stars moving, or the sun and stars being at rest and the earth moving? In Wonders of the Sun, Moon, and Stars by R. Russell, it is stated that, quote, "The speed of the surface of the earth in performing its rotations is 1,526 feet per second. Great as that speed is, it is slow when compared to the earth's progress in its orbit, which is at the rate of 18 miles per second, or more than 65,000 miles per hour." End quote. Then, in the Story of the Heavens, page 429, we're informed by Sir R. Ball that, quote, "Every half hour we're about 10,000 miles nearer to the constellation of Lyra. The sun and his system must travel at the present rate for more than 1,000,000 years before we have crossed the abyss between our present position and the frontiers of Lyra." End quote. Sun, Moon, and Stars by Gibberne states that, quote, "It is the earth that moves and not the sun. It is the earth that moves and not the stars." End quote. From these extracts, the reader is given to some text missing here, by those who have made their astronomy their life, text missing, therefore ought to know that in 1 hour, text missing, sorry about that. Quote, the Earth rotates over 1,000 miles, revolves around the Sun over 65,000 miles, and rushes through space towards the constellation Lyra at a distance of 20,000 miles per hour, end quote. The total rate of rotation, revolution, and gyration amounting to no less than 80,000 miles an hour. This casts a total eclipse over all that Jules Verne ever wrote. Put together all the imaginary exploits in the air specially written to interest the young, add to this all the wonderful adventures of airships recorded in The Daughter of the Revolution, and tack onto this all the wild and impossible things found in current libraries of fiction, and I venture to say that the grand total will record nothing so utterly impossible or so supremely ridiculous as this modern scientific delusion of a globe spinning away in space several different directions at the same time at rates of speed which no man is able to grasp, with the inhabitants, some hanging heads down and others at various angles to suit the inclination. Write down all the swindles that ever were perpetrated, name all the hoaxes you ever heard of or read about, include all the impostures and bubbles ever exposed, make a list of all the snares that popular credulity could ever be exposed to, and you will fail in getting within sight or hearing of an imposture so gross, a hoax so ingenious, or a bubble of such gigantic proportions as has been perpetrated and forced upon unthinking multitudes in the name of science, and as proved incontrovertible fact by the expounders of modern astronomy. Again and again have their theories been combated and exposed, but as often have the majority, who do not think for themselves, accepted the popular thing. No less an authority in his time than the celebrated Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe argued that if the Earth revolves in an orbit round the Sun, the change in the relative position of the stars thus necessarily occasioned could not fail to be noticed. In the History of Conflict Between Religion and Science, by Dr. Draper, pages 175 and 176, the matter is referred to in the following words. Quote, among the arguments brought forward against the Copernican system at the time of its promulgation was one by the great Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, originally urged by Aristarchus against the Pythagorean system, to the effect that, if, as was alleged, the Earth moves around the Sun, there ought to be a change in the relative position of the stars. They should seem to separate as we approach them, or to close together as we recede from them. At that time the Sun's distance was greatly underestimated. Had it been known, as it is now, that the distance exceeds 90 million miles, or that the diameter of the orbit is more than 180 million, that the argument would doubtless have had very great weight. In reply to Tycho, it is said that since the parallax of a body diminishes as its distance increases, a star may be so far off that its parallax may be imperceptible. This answer proved to be correct. End quote. To the uninitiated, the words, "this answer proved to be correct," might seem to settle the matter, and while it must be admitted that parallax is diminished or increased according as the star is distant or near, parallax and direction are very different terms, and convey quite different meanings. Tycho stated that the direction of the stars would be altered. His critics replied that the distance gave no sensible difference of parallax. This may be set down as ingenious, but it is no answer to the proposition, which has remained unanswered to this hour, and is unanswerable. If the Earth is at a given point in space on, say, January 1st, and according to present-day science, at a distance of 190 million miles from that point 6 months afterwards, it follows that the relative position and direction of the stars will have greatly changed, however small the angle of parallax may be. That this great change is nowhere apparent, and has never been observed, incontestably proves that the Earth is at rest, that it does not move in an orbit round the sun at all. That the Earth does not rotate on its axis is proved by the fact that no observer on the surface of a globe could see halfway round it, or for a distance of 1,000 miles on either side of him, as he would require to do in order to see around a circle of 180 degrees to view the setting sun and the rising moon at one time. Sir Henry Holland, in his Recollections of a Past Life, says that, quote, on 20th April, 1837, the moon rose eclipsed before the sun had set. End quote. Now, on a globe of 25,000 statute miles equatorial circumference, one has to be 24 feet above sea level to get a horizon of 6 miles, the so-called curvature being 8 inches to the mile and varying inversely with the square of the distance. We are thus taught to believe that what appears at all times of the day to be a half circle, or about 180 degrees, is in reality only a few miles, as the Earth rotates against the sun and thus deceives us. But the phenomenon of a lunar eclipse requires, according to astronomical doctrine, that the Earth shall be exactly midway between the sun and the moon to shut off the light of the sun and thus to darken the moon. These two, quote, bodies being then, according to the astronomer, opposite each other and the Earth between, must each be 90 degrees or a quarter of a circle distant from an observer on the Earth's surface, that is, a half circle from one to the other, so that what astronomy on one hand teaches is only a few miles distant the horizon, is thus seen to be, according to its own showing, a half circle, for the sun is at one side of the quadrant and the moon at the other side of another quadrant. If, therefore, the observer be on the equator when the phenomenon occurs, he can see, according to astronomical measurement, over 6,000 miles on either side of him, east and west. If in north or south latitude, he would see correspondingly less, but thousands of miles in every case. But, on the other hand, according to the popular theory, he would have to be hoisted 4,000 miles away in space for such a thing to be possible. The fact of lunar eclipses having been observed when sun and moon were both above the horizon at the time of the eclipse, and thus that the observer pierced, with the unaided eye, a distance of thousands of miles on either side of him, about a half a circle, proves that the Earth does not rotate, and that it is not the globe of popular belief. Sir Henry Holland further informs us that, quote, this spectacle requires, however, a combination of circumstances rarely occurring, a perfectly clear eastern and western horizon, and an entirely level intervening surface, such as that of the sea or the African desert. End quote. It is this level intervening surface that defies all astronomical attempts to make it convex, and proves beyond the possibility of any doubt that the Earth is an extended plane and not a globe at all. Furthermore, if the Earth globe rotates on its axis at the terrific rate of 1,000 miles an hour, such an immense mass would of necessity cause a tremendous rush of wind in the space it occupied. The wind would go all one way, and anything like clouds which got within the sphere of influence of the rotating sphere would have to go the same way. The fact that the Earth is at rest is proved by kite flying. The following from the American Exporter of November 1897 illustrates this. Quote, recently a very interesting experiment was made in high kite flying at Boston from the Blue Hill Observatory, when the highest altitude ever reached by a kite was obtained. The top kite reached a height of 10,016 feet above sea level, or 8,386 feet above the summit of the hill. At the highest point reached the temperature was 38 degrees, while at the ground it was 63 degrees. Above 5,000 feet, the wind was from the west, while at the ground there was a southerly wind. End quote. Astronomers are not agreed about the depth of the Earth's atmosphere, but the lowest estimate is about 45 miles. Therefore, everything within the atmosphere would be subject to the gale of wind produced by the mad whirling of the rotating globe. When, however, we know that above 5,000 feet the wind was from the west, while at the ground there was a southerly wind, the fact of the earth being at rest again dawns on us. How could there be two different directions of the wind at a distance of only 5,000 feet apart, if globular hypothesis are anywhere near the truth? Spin a top, and it will be seen that the rotation of the top causes the air within its sphere of rotation to go all one way. Let imagination picture to the mind what force air would have, which was set in motion by a spherical body of 8,000 miles diameter, which in 1 hour was spinning round 1,000 miles, rushing through space 65,000 miles, and gyrating across the heavens at 20,000 miles. Then let conjecture endeavor to discover whether the inhabitants on such a globe could keep their hair on. Talk about Jules Verne. He is not in it with the expounders of this most exact of all the sciences. A.E. Skellum says, quote, "The following experiment has been tried many times, and the reasonable deduction from it are entirely against any theory of motion. A loaded cannon was set vertical by a plumb line and spirit level and fired. The average time the ball was in the air are 28 seconds. On several occasions the ball returned to the mouth of the cannon, and never fell more than 2 feet from its base, as shown in Figure 1. Figures omitted. Now let us see what the result would be if the earth were a rapidly rotating sphere. The ball would partake of two motions, the one from the cannon, vertical, and the other from the earth, from west to east, and would arrive at B, Figure 2. While it had been ascending, the earth with the cannon would have gone on to C. In descending, it would have no impulse from the earth's motion or from the cannon, and would fall in a straight line at C. But during the time it were falling, the earth with the cannon would have traveled on to D, and the ball would fall, allowing the world's rotation to be 600 miles per hour in England, more than 2 miles behind the cannon." So that's end section 3, Zetetic Cosmogony. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you're enjoying this audiobook series. If you'd like to become a channel contributor, see the links in the description. Thanks so much. God bless. Spread the word, spread the world, and peace out, everybody.